She became Queen of England, but she never had control over her own life. Anne Neville, the wife of Richard III, a woman who moved through the center of power, yet left behind almost no voice of her own. Her story is not just about royalty. It is about survival in a world where survival was never guaranteed. She was born on June 11th, 1456, at Warwick Castle, into one of the most powerful noble families in England. Her father, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, was one of the most influential men in the kingdom, a man later remembered as the Kingmaker. But power did not protect Anne. It defined her. From the very beginning, she was more than a daughter. She was an heiress, a valuable match, a future alliance, a piece in a much larger struggle already tearing England apart. This was the world of the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic conflict between Lancaster and York, two rival branches of the royal family, both descended from Edward III. When Anne was born, Henry VI was on the throne. But weakness at the center of power rarely brings peace. It creates opportunity. It invites, and men like Anne's father knew how to use it. Warwick supported the House of York and helped bring Edward IV to the throne in 1461. For a moment, it must have seemed that Anne's family stood on the winning side of history. But in this war, victory never stayed still for long. And this is only the beginning. If you enjoy thoughtful history, stay with this channel and subscribe. Everything changed when Edward IV secretly married Elizabeth Woodville in 1464. Not a foreign princess. Not the kind of match Warwick had hoped to arrange. To Warwick, this was more than a disappointment. It was a humiliation, a sign that his influence was slipping. And in a kingdom built on loyalty, pride, and power, that kind of insult could become dangerous. Over the next few years, the relationship between king and kingmaker broke apart. Warwick rebelled, and then he did something even more shocking. He turned to his former enemy, Margaret of Anjou, the wife of Henry VI. Together they formed a new alliance against Edward IV, and to seal it, Anne was chosen. She was still very young, around 14 years old, but her wishes did not matter. Her future was decided for her. She would marry Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, the Lancastrian heir, the son of the woman her father had spent years fighting against. It was not a love story. It was politics. In 1470, Anne was married in France and became Princess of Wales, but her new rank rested on war, and war offers no safety. In the spring of 1471, Edward IV returned to England and struck back fast. In April, Warwick was killed at the Battle of Barnet. Anne lost her father. Then, only weeks later, on May 4th, 1471, her husband was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury. The Lancastrian cause collapsed. Anne was left a widow at around 15 years old, a princess without power, a daughter without protection, and one of the greatest heiresses in England, which meant that even in ruin, she was still valuable. After Tewkesbury, Anne did not become free. She became a prize, a young widow with a ruined title but with immense inheritance rights tied to the Neville family. That made her important again. Not for who she was, but for what she brought with her. She was placed in the custody of her brother-in-law, George, Duke of Clarence, the husband of her sister Isabel, and Clarence had every reason to keep control of her. Through his marriage, he already held much of the Neville wealth. If Anne married again, that wealth could be divided. And in this family, power was never surrendered willingly. Then Richard entered the story again. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the younger brother of Edward IV, a man Anne had known from earlier years when he had lived at Middleham under her father's protection. Now he wanted to marry her. Whether there was real affection between them has never been proven. Historians have long debated it. Some point to the familiarity of their early connection. Others see the marriage as strategic, and in truth, it is impossible to separate feeling from advantage in a world like this. What is certain is that the match made political sense. Anne brought land, status, and influence. Richard brought royal blood, protection, and a path out of Clarence's control. Clarence resisted. He did not want to share what he considered his. Disputes followed. There are later stories that Anne was hidden away to prevent Richard from reaching her. Even one famous tale that she was found disguised as a servant in London. But those details are uncertain. What is clear is that the struggle over Anne was real. And in the end, Richard won. By 1472, they were married. Anne became Duchess of Gloucester, and for the first time in her life, the pace of disaster seemed to slow. She and Richard lived mainly in the north of England, especially at Middleham Castle. It was the place where Anne had spent part of her childhood. Far from the constant tension of the southern court, this was a different kind of life. Quieter, more regional, more stable, at least on the surface. She was no longer the widow of the Lancastrian prince. No longer a displaced girl caught between defeated causes. She now held a defined place in the Yorkist world. In time, she gave birth to a son, Edward of Middleham, their only known surviving child. His exact birth year is uncertain, but his importance was not. He was their heir. In a dynasty built on inheritance, that meant everything. For a while, Anne's life seems almost to settle into something resembling security. She had rank, she had a household, she had a son. And there are signs that she sometimes acted on Richard's behalf in his absence, appearing publicly as part of his authority in the north. But even in this quieter chapter, loss never moved far away. In December 1476, her sister Isabel died not long after childbirth. She was only 25. Another woman of Anne's world, consumed by marriage, pregnancy, and dynastic expectation. Then came another fall from within the same family. George, Duke of Clarence, the man who had once fought to control Anne's future, was arrested for treason against his own brother, Edward IV. In 1478, he was executed in the Tower of London. Tradition later claimed he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. Whether that detail is legend or truth, the end was the same. Another royal brother destroyed, another branch of the family broken, and Anne lived through all of it in near silence. We can trace the deaths around her. We can follow the movement of titles and power. But we still do not know what she felt as one familiar world after another collapsed. And then, in 1483, everything changed again. Edward IV died suddenly. He was only 40. His heir, Edward V, was just 12 years old. A child king in a kingdom where childhood offered no protection at all. Richard moved quickly. As the late king's brother, he claimed the role of protector. But protection and control were not the same thing. He intercepted the young Edward V on his journey to London, arrested the men guiding him, and took custody of the boy. Soon after, the king's younger brother Richard, Duke of York, joined him in the Tower of London. At first, this could still be presented as preparation for a coronation. The Tower was, after all, a royal residence as well as a fortress. But then the story darkened. The coronation never came. Instead, Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was declared invalid, and their children were declared illegitimate. That decision cleared the way for Richard to take the crown himself. On June 26, 1483, he became Richard III, and Anne Neville became queen. It was an extraordinary rise. The daughter of the Kingmaker, the widow of the Lancastrian prince, now Queen of England. But even at its highest point, her story did not become safer. It became more dangerous, because this crown came wrapped in suspicion. The two princes remained in the tower, and then they vanished from public view. No certain answer ever came, only silence. And silence in politics can be louder than any accusation. Whether Anne knew what to think, what to fear, or what to believe, we do not know. History leaves her standing beside one of the most controversial moments in English history, but gives us almost nothing of her mind. On July 6, 1483, she and Richard were crowned together at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the grand reward at the end of a brutal life. The moment when everything that had been taken from her was finally answered by rank, ceremony, and glory. But that is not how her story works. The crown did not erase the past. It only placed her at the center of a new storm. The new reign faced immediate instability. Rebellion spread that same year. Old loyalties shifted again. England did not greet Richard III with peace, and Anne, now queen, had to stand inside that uncertainty, carrying all the grandeur of the title and none of its safety. Yet one thing still seemed secure: her son, Edward of Middleham, their only known surviving child, their heir. The future of the dynasty rested on him, and perhaps for Anne, after years of being traded through politics and war, that child represented something more than succession. He may have been the only part of her life that felt truly her own. But in 1484, that too was taken from her. Edward died while still a child, probably around 10 years old. The exact cause is unknown, but it was almost certainly illness. For Anne, this was not just personal grief. It was the collapse of everything ahead. Without an heir, the future of Richard's reign became uncertain. Without a son, Anne's own place became more fragile. She had already lost a father, a first husband, a sister, and nearly every illusion of safety. Now she lost the child who tied her to the future. And after that, her world seems to narrow. Her health began to fail not long after. The sources do not give us a full, intimate portrait of her final months. They never do. Anne remains distant even at the end, seen through ceremony, rumor, and the records of others. But by early 1485, it was clear that something was wrong. She was still young, not yet 30, and yet the woman who had survived so many reversals now seemed to be fading. Then, on March 16, 1485, Anne Neville died at Westminster. She was about 28 years old. Even her death did not escape suspicion. There were whispers, as there always were around power. Some believed she had been poisoned. Some suspected darker motives at court. But there is no solid evidence for murder, and illness remains the most likely explanation. In Anne's life, tragedy did not need conspiracy. History had already given her more than enough of it. She was buried at Westminster Abbey, a Queen of England laid to rest with the dignity of her rank. But the stability that rank was supposed to promise had never truly belonged to her. Even in death, the kingdom around her remained unsettled. Rumors spread that Richard might marry again, most notoriously that he might seek marriage with his niece, Elizabeth of York. He publicly denied it. Whether the rumor was political slander, fear, or something more serious, it shows how exposed the throne had become. Anne was gone. Their son was gone. And the dynasty stood on increasingly weak ground. Richard himself would not survive her by long. Just 5 months later, on August 22nd, 1485, he was killed at the Battle of Bosworth. With his death, the Yorkist dynasty fell, and Henry VII took the crown. A new age began. And Anne Neville, who had moved through so many violent turns of English history, was left behind in the shadows of larger names and louder legends. But her story deserves more than that. Because Anne did not merely witness the Wars of the Roses. She was shaped by them at every stage of her life. She was born the daughter of the Kingmaker, married first to the Lancastrian heir, widowed in the collapse of one cause, married again into the Yorkist royal house, then crowned queen beside one of the most disputed kings in English history. She lived at the heart of dynastic struggle, yet almost never spoke in the record with a voice we can clearly hear. And that silence is part of what makes her story so haunting. We know the men around her, their ambitions, their betrayals, their battles, their claims, their downfalls. But Anne herself is harder to reach. Not because her life lacked importance, but because women like her were so rarely allowed to leave a full account of themselves. Her story survives in fragments, in marriages arranged by others, in titles gained and lost, in funerals, in coronations, in the deaths of men and boys around her. And maybe that is the deepest tragedy of all. Not simply that Anne Neville suffered, but that she suffered at the center of history and still remains, in so many ways, half hidden from it. She became Princess of Wales. She became Duchess of Gloucester. She became Queen of England. But she was never free from the world that used her. And in the end, Anne Neville was not remembered because history understood her. She was remembered because history passed through her life like a storm. Thank you for watching. If you value history told carefully and accurately, consider staying with this channel and subscribing. The past deserves precision as much as curiosity.